Hey, Walter Sorrells back with more tips for the knife maker. Today, firearms finishes. So look, what do firearms finishes have to do with making knives? Well, potentially a lot, actually. I'm really excited about this video because I've been wanting to do it for a long time. There are a lot of firearms coatings out there, and many of them are used as coatings for knife blades. So I've been hankering to do a compare and contrast evaluation for a long time. So this video hopefully will be useful to you whether you're a firearms guy, a knife guy, or somebody who's interested in both. If you're a firearms guy, you already know what firearms finishes are and why they're useful. Basically, they're used to add sort of an aftermarket finish to an existing firearm. So you can use any number of colors and customize your own firearm. So why would they be useful to knife makers? Well, the reason is that if you're using a carbon steel blade and you want to inhibit rust, you can put firearms finishes on there. Some of them are quite durable and they'll keep your knife from rusting over time. Also, you may just want to customize something and make it a cool color, so that can be useful too. Alright, so what I did here in this video is take a wide range of different firearms finishes and a couple of paints that are sometimes used to color firearms and tested them out for durability and ease of use, and also I'll talk a little bit about the cost of these finishes. Which one's the best? Which one's the best for you? Let's find out. We'll be testing 3 popular coatings and 2 paints that are often used to color firearms. Here are the competitors. On the firearm finish front, we've got DuraCoat, Cerakote, and Moly Resin. We'll also test 2 paints sold specifically as camouflage paints, Krylon and Rust-Oleum. Of course, both of those can be used to coat firearms and knife blades. Here's how the test will work. I'll apply the finishes to test blanks more or less according to the manufacturer's instructions. More on that later. And then we'll test durability using a little gizmo that I built for the test. I'll also give a general evaluation of the ease of use and let you know what the finish cost. So, let's start there. Money. The most expensive product was Cerakote at $35 for a 4-ounce bottle. Moly Resin cost $29, but for a larger 8-ounce supply, while DuraCoat was $21.95 for 4 ounces. The paints, as you'd expect, were way cheaper. Krylon cost me $7.99 at AutoZone, while Rust-Oleum was the cheapest of all at $5.99 from the Home Depot. More on cost when I do the wrap-up. I made 5 test blanks. These are 1095 steel, a common high carbon steel. Now, a general note about finishes generally. Surface prep is king, meaning that the best finish in the world won't hold up when applied to a poorly prepared surface. The biggest enemy is oil. I simply ground the test blanks to a 220 grit finish, degreased them with a lacquer thinner, and then blasted them with aluminum oxide blast media, making sure to handle them very carefully so as not to contaminate them with oil from my fingers. This left them with a good surface for applying a metal finish. I then mixed and applied the finishes according to manufacturer's instructions, applying the finishes immediately to the test blanks so as not to allow the samples time to rust or accumulate crud. I won't get into the details of application because this isn't a how-to video. I will mention though that DuraCoat and Cerakote require the mixing of a hardener into the finish. Moly Resin, on the other hand, was simply applied straight from the bottle. Moly Resin recommends use of an airbrush, whereas the others were applied with an HVLP paint sprayer. My guess is that Moly Resin would go on fine with an HVLP sprayer, but I can't tell you that for certain. I was following the manufacturer's recommendations. That's what they said to do, so I did it. The DuraCoat sample was then left to cure at room temperature, while the Cerakote and Moly Resin samples required heat curing, which I performed in my heat treating oven at 250 and 300 degrees respectively. Again, following the manufacturer's instructions. Now, all the manufacturers specify that the finishes should be applied to a certain thickness, usually around 1 mil. Now, I have no way to measure this, so I just applied the finish until it was opaque, and then I quit. I can't promise you they were all applied with optimal thickness, but I did my best. The paints, of course, were applied by spraying and then left to dry. Easy peasy. Next, I tested the durability of the samples. I did this by constructing this little setup. This gizmo rides on the sample with the weight bearing here on a piece of 220 grit sandpaper. After the durability test, I also tested the samples to see how they held up to solvents. Okay, so let's talk about the results. First, cost. Now, this is trickier than it seems. I told you how much all these products cost, and safe to say Cerakote's the most expensive finish, and Rust-Oleum's the cheapest. But there's some nuance here. Since Moly Resin isn't mixed, you basically don't waste any, whereas with DuraCoat and Cerakote, just to be sure, you always have to mix a little extra, and then you throw that extra away. So that adds quite substantially to the cost. Also, the mix ratios are fairly important, so it's hard to actually mix the material if you use much less than a couple of ounces of liquid. So, best case scenario, you're not going to get more than a couple of uses out of a small bottle of Cerakote or DuraCoat, whereas you could bust out a new job with the Moly Resin every day for a month or two and probably not run out. If you're using these as firearms finishes for hobbyist purposes, you probably won't care that much. 4 ounces is plenty of finish for a single rifle, several pistols, or a bunch of knives. You buy a bottle, you paint a gun, a knife blade or two, whatever, and you're done. On the other hand, if you want to use them, say, for hobbyist knife projects, or if you're a part-time gunsmith and you wanted to apply a finish every week or two, Moly Resin would be way more economical than the other two options. Shelf life is supposedly about 6 months for Moly Resin, whereas the other two have to be thrown away a couple hours after mixing. So, under the right circumstances, you could get astronomically more value out of Moly Resin. If you're only doing 1 or 2 projects, though, it's kind of a wash. Want to see videos more often on this channel? Better videos? You can help. Consider partnering with the channel by clicking on the link to Patreon. Thanks. Now, back to work. Ease of application. As you might expect, hands down, paint's the easiest to apply. You still should prep the surface, which is where a lot of the time is invested. That's the theory anyway, but why knock yourself out perfectly prepping a basically inferior consumable type finish in the first place? I'm skipping ahead to the conclusions, but look, realistically, if you're just looking for a knock-around finish to get you through your tour over in the stands, well, maybe you don't need to bother with a whole bunch of finicky prep. Degrease it, scuff it up with Scotch-Brite or something, and slap on the paint, in which case you're way ahead, not only in cost, but in time, energy, and general fussing around. On the other hand, if you want something that's durable, you want one of the more serious finishes. All of them have to be sprayed on, so if you don't have a compressor, an airbrush, or a dedicated paint spraying rig, then you're into some serious money before you spray the first blob of paint. I should also add that DuraCoat sells single spray use can applicators, so there is a workaround here for DuraCoat, but I didn't test that product here, so I don't have any reason to think that it's different from the ones that we used here where you mix it yourself, but for all I know it could be. So, that said, Of the three, Moly Resin is the easiest to apply because you don't have to mix it. But honestly, the bulk of your work is in surface preparation, so in the grand scheme of things, that doesn't matter a huge amount. But still, Cerakote and DuraCoat are more complex to apply because of the mixing involved. Just one last point. I've known a bunch of guys who've used firearm finishes in a very wide number of applications, including rifles, pistols, knives, on plastic, on metal, handles of knives, and so on. And don't fool yourself into thinking that any of these will last forever. If you put them on a knife blade, they'll wear off eventually under use, as well as from contact with Kydex or molded plastic sheaths. If you put them on a pistol, the holster will create rub marks and wear through the finish at the corners, just like they would with traditional finishes like parkerizing or bluing. I'm not saying it happens overnight, but it will happen eventually. Rifles are probably the applications where they'll hold up best since there's no holstering involved. But under duty conditions where you're carrying a weapon on a constant basis, resting it on the ground, throwing it in the trunk of your cruiser, whatever, you'll experience wear there too. So just recognize nothing lasts forever. A few general final notes. Both Cerakote and DuraCoat offer a stupefying number of colors. Moly Resin has fewer, but way more than I could imagine using. Paint, on the other hand, is available in only a few colors. Okay, so let's get into the nitty-gritty of the durability testing. As I said, I constructed a little testing rig to test the abrasive resistance of the various finishes. Pretty simple, basically a board with a pin in it for holding the test samples steady. And this thing, I don't know what you'd call it. I could come up with a fancy name for it, but the idea is that it's made so you can stick a piece of sandpaper here, then put a weight on top and drag it down the length of the sample with all the weight bearing on the sandpaper. So let's call it a dragger thingy. I'm a man of words, what can I say? Each sample was put on the board, and the dragger thingy was pulled down the sample with a piece of 220 grit sandpaper affixed to the dragger thingy. Every 10 repetitions, the sandpaper was replaced. I put spray adhesive on the backing so it would stick. So here we go. First sample, dragging, different angle. Another sample, another angle. I just hope you appreciate how many times I moved the camera for your exclusive viewing pleasure. So I went through all the samples and recorded how long it took for me to break all the way through the finish. Then I flipped them and repeated the process on the other side, again recording how long it took to break through. I wish I could say this was the most scientifically valid test imaginable, but what I found as I began the test was it was a lot more subjective than I would have thought. The idea was to quit when a solid stripe of bare steel was exposed. What I found was that several of the samples dug little stripes in and then kind of stabilized without killing off the strip of coating in the middle. So basically I quit when those two stripes were really bold and clear, but I'd be lying if I said this wasn't somewhat of a judgment call. Another point is that the thickness of the finish had an impact on how quickly I wore through. Since all the finishes probably didn't go on at the exact same thickness, some were probably at a disadvantage, and my perception is that the thinnest finish I applied was Moly Resin because I did it with a little bitty airbrush. So make of that what you will. Maybe the Moly Resin was at a little bit of a disadvantage. So, recognizing that this test wasn't perfect, not totally scientific, whatever, here were the results. The paints pretty much did the worst. Rust-Oleum averaged 25 repetitions before it was toast. Krylon held up better, about 30 strokes on average. Remember, this was not regular old Krylon paint. It was, well, supposedly better than regular paint, though I couldn't tell you exactly how. I'm going to make some excuses for Moly Resin. First, as I said, it was applied very thinly, There's a shelf life to this product, and it was reaching somewhere near the end of that shelf life, so maybe I was being unfair to Moly Resin. Or maybe not. Bottom line, performance of the sample that I used here was not so impressive. It averaged around 30 strokes before it gave up. DuraCoat was next, averaging 50 strokes before it gave up the ghost. And at the top was Cerakote with 95 strokes on average before it crapped out. Also, subjectively, Cerakote just felt the most robust. But that said, look, at the end of the day, all of these wore out fairly quickly. A little more so than I expected. All the samples from top to bottom were showing some bare metal about 30% of the way before I quit. Rust-Oleum, for instance, was already showing some bare metal in about 5 strokes, and Cerakote had a little metal gleaming through within 30 strokes. Now, of course, you're not going to line your sheath or holster with sandpaper. This is not normal use. It's just a way of gauging relative wear resistance. So, what am I getting at? There are no miracles here. As I said before, all this stuff will wear through if you put it to hard use. Second durability test. I scrubbed each of the samples with Hoppy's No. 9 bore solvent for 60 seconds. Yes, Hoppy's is the correct pronunciation, guys. I called it Hops for years, but I was wrong. Anyway, all samples held up just fine. Third, this mirrored test 2, but using a much more aggressive solvent, lacquer thinner. The paint disappeared like the tears of a virgin in a Saudi Arabian sandstorm. The resin-type products, on the other hand, Moly Resin, Cerakote, and DuraCoat, were completely impervious. So, if you plan to dunk your firearm or knife into industrial solvents, don't go with either of the paints. At least as far as this test could determine, Cerakote is the clear durability champion. DuraCoat was second, and the rest were well behind that. So, what would I recommend? Again, the answer's not so simple, but it comes down to this. First, screw Rust-Oleum. If you want ease of application and cheapness, go with Krylon. If you want ease of application in a relatively reasonably priced resin-type product that you can use repeatedly for months, go with Moly Resin. If you want the most durable product, go with Cerakote. And what about DuraCoat? Decent product, but not as good as Cerakote. Okay, in fairness, you don't have to heat it, but you can put Cerakote in your kitchen oven and cure it just fine. Sorry, DuraCoat, second place is just first loser, right? Me, I'm going to put a finish on a knife or a firearm. I'm going to go with Cerakote. Bam. So I hope you walk away with a little bit of interesting information here. So obviously I don't have $1 million testing lab or whatever. You have to take the results for my testing here with a pinch of salt, but hopefully they'll be useful in helping you to evaluate which firearms finish might be useful for you in either a gunsmithing or knife making project. Hey guys, if you found value in this video, I hope you'll consider partnering with the channel to help us bring more videos, better videos, more knives, more techniques, all that cool stuff. Click the link to Patreon to help this channel. Also, if you haven't subscribed yet, bro, what are you waiting on? And check me out on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, all that good stuff. Also, if you're into Japanese swords, check out my website, waltersorrellsblades.com, where you'll see more of my work and where you'll find videos about the making of Japanese swords, along with mounting, fittings, polishing, hamones, all kinds of good stuff. Now, more videos.